This is section 1.3, the note-taking guide for our Math 1 curriculum. So today the title of our lesson is Terms, Factors, Coefficients, all of expressions. So terms, factors, and coefficients of expressions. The first thing we need to do is we need to decide what those actually are. So there's some definitions here we want to go over and just kind of talk about to make sure that we understand what each one of those words mean. The first definition up here is expression. So it says an expression contains at least one variable, one number, and one operation. An example of an algebraic expression is n plus 7. So you can see that that n plus 7 there contains one variable, the n, one number, the 7, and one operation, which is the plus sign. So that's an expression when we're putting those things together. The second thing is a variable. A variable is a letter used in place of a number. So x, y, z, and are variables. The next definition is a constant. A constant is a number that stands all by itself. So up there in that case of the n plus 7, the number that stands all by itself is the 7. It's not attached without an operation between it to a variable. It's called a constant when it's not attached to a variable. A coefficient is a number in front of or attached to a variable. So up there in the case of the n plus 7, I want you to think about what number's in front of the n. How many n's are there? The number of n's that are there would be 1. There's one n there, so the number in front or the coefficient on that variable would be the number 1. Okay, the next definition is for a term. A term is part of an expression that is separated by an operation. So up here again on this n plus 7, I have two terms because in between that plus sign, or in between them is that plus sign. So term 1, term 2. So two terms in that expression. Then the last one says a factor is an individual number or variable that is used to make a term. So up here when we're talking about this 1n, we would have 1 as a term. We would have we have 1n as a term, but the factors would be 1 and the factor would be n. On the 7, we only have the 7 there is not attached to a variable or anything, so it's a constant number, but the factors of that would be any numbers that could make 7. So in this case, it's 1 times 7 to be factors. Now let's just talk about what if that number would have been an 8 instead. If that number would have been an 8, I could have done 1 times 8 to get 8. I could have done 2 times 4 to get 8. So I actually have more factors of the number 8 than I did have of the number 7. So again, a factor is any number that will divide into the term itself. All right, so down here on the bottom of this now it says use the table to identify the parts of each expression. The first thing I want to do when I'm looking at my expression is I want to make sure that my expression is in simplest terms, or there's nothing that can be combined together. So 2x minus 6y and positive 2. They can't be combined together. They're not like terms. The first one has an x on it. The second one has a y on it. So they're not like terms. And the third one just happens to be a constant number. It's the number 2. So when I'm looking at this, and I'm going to fill out this table now, it says, well, what's the terms? Well, the terms would be each separate part. So I'd have 2x, I'd have a negative 6y, and I'd have a positive 2. Those are my terms on my expression. So from there, now what I'm going to do is just keep filling out this chart here. So now I'm going to use these boxes here to fill out the next part. So here's my 2x. The factors of that would be the number 1, the number 2, because those would times together to be 2, and then x. So I actually have lots of factors of that term. I have 1, 2, and x. For the term negative 6x, I actually now need to list the factors of that. Well, to get that negative there, I would have to have a negative 1 times 6. I also could have had 2 times 3 to get to 6. And then I have the y. So I have a lot of little numbers there I fit into that box. And then the factors of 2 would just be 1 and 2, because 1 times 2 is 2. Okay, looking back up at this part right here, we're going to use these boxes again to answer the next part. The coefficient is the number in front of a variable. In this case, the coefficient is 2. In this case, the number out in front of the variable is -6. And in this case, there's not a coefficient because there's not a variable to look in front of. So I'm going to write none. If you wanted to, though, in math, if you remember what we use as a representation of none, you could have used that symbol, and I'm going to show you what that symbol is. Just a reminder, it's that circle with a line through it. So you could write that symbol there instead if that's what you wanted to do. All right, constants. 2x doesn't have a constant. It's attached to the variable. -6y doesn't have a constant. It's attached to the variable. The number 2 is actually a constant, though, because it is not attached to a variable. So to give you an idea, this is kind of what we're doing here on these expressions here. So we have one more chart here that we're going to fill out, doing the exact same thing. So let's look at this next one and let's just do our best. The very first thing I want you to notice here, though, is I do have like terms up here that I need to combine together into one constant or one term of that expression. So the -3x and the 5.5x, those actually add together to be 2.5x. So instead of, sorry, my decimal point doesn't look like a decimal point. Instead of having these two terms separately, we're going to combine them together to have just that one term there. So when we write out our terms here, we're going to have 8x squared here. We're going to have 2.5x here, and then we'll have a -9x here because our terms are each part of our expression after we've simplified our expression. So factors of this, again, when we list our factors, we're going to have to list our factors of 8. So you could have 1 and 8. You can have 2 and 4 to get to 8. X squared would be x times x. You don't really have to write the same variable twice on that, but I just wanted you to know that that's where that was coming from. All right, 2.5, that's kind of funny for a factor, but how do we get 2.5? We would do 1 times 2.5. So those would be the factors of the 2.5, and the factors of x would just be x. -9, we could have, of course, -1 out front. We could times it by 9. We could also had a -9 there on that. So sometimes I like to just not worry about that sign and just think about my factors. I could have also had 3 times 3. I don't really have to write that 3 twice. It doesn't have to be shown there. To take care of the negative, though, I could have a -3 times a +3. Again, I don't have to show that +3 a second time. All right, coefficients are the number out in front of the variable, so the number 8 in this case, the number 2.5 in this case, and coefficients has to be in front of the variable, so there's not one here. Constants have to stand alone without a variable, so that's not standing alone without a variable. This one's not standing alone without a variable, so our only constant in this expression is that -9. All right, next page, same thing here. We're just answering some questions about the expression here. It says 4 is an, and there's actually several things that could be. 4 is a coefficient because it's in front of a variable. But you also could have said that 4 is a factor because 1 times 4 gives you 4. So a coefficient or a factor. X on this is actually a variable, but you also could have called it a factor, and really most of the time on these questions it can be a factor. 12 is a constant. It's back there standing by itself. But again, 12 is going to be a factor of itself, so it could be a factor also. Okay. 3b, the whole thing is actually going to be called a term. The whole thing added or subtracted is a term. The 3 then could be a factor of that term, or in this case also, it could be a coefficient. I'm going to start abbreviating, not writing the whole thing out here. So coefficient on that. B also could be a factor. And B is also a variable. So lots of different answers here on these problems. All right, a little bit longer on this last one here. It's going to take just a second longer to do this maybe. But 3 terms this time that we're looking at. 3 separate terms. On this one, the -8 there is going to be a coefficient because it's in front of a variable. It also, like I said before, could be a factor because that's how you can multiply by -8 to get to -8. Looking here at the 4 could be a term because it's by itself separated by that addition sign. But it's also a constant because there's no variable on it. So a term or a constant. 3x squared is a term because it's separated by that minus sign. And it's all chunked together into the whole term. Thanks for watching this video, you guys. I hope it helps you on your homework. Good luck.